Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writer Center, and I am also a writer and novelist, primarily fiction writer. Occasionally I write non-fiction-y things, so I am at least slightly qualified for the discussion we're about to have. And it's my pleasure to get to welcome Sufia Abdur-Rahman to the event today, the author of the book Heir to the Crescent Moon, which is really, really fabulous. I need to tilt down so it's not getting glared upon. Sufia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you having me and all the people who have come tonight. This is great.
You have your book handy to read something from? Perfect.
Yes, and I have the copy that's not super shiny, so I can show it to you.
Yes, I have the advanced reader's copy, so it's not the official copy. But yeah, if you do read us a brief excerpt so people have an idea of what we're going to be talking about here in a minute.
Absolutely. I'm going to read from the prologue, which is called My Father, and just the first couple of pages to give you a taste of what this book is like. It begins. Before I even understood what a Muslim was, I knew I wanted to be one because my father was. Both of my parents were. This meant that I was too, but simply being born Muslim was not enough. When I was 5 years old in 1984, my father taught me that being Muslim is something more. He had a way of gliding into a room, walking on the balls of his feet like his heels were too good to touch ground. His steps were soundless that day, except for the faint swishing of his ashen soles across our cheap linoleum. I watched him as he strode from the hallway into the dining room, fingering a string of beads in his right hand. I had seen them before, hanging from a nail in the wall of his office at the opposite end of the hallway most of the time, and clenched in his hand at others. The beads were simple, plain brown, perfectly round, smaller than marbles, but bigger than sweet peas. They were strung together like a necklace, except where the clasp should have been, 1 or 2 or 3 extra beads jutted out and led to a stiff brown tassel hanging from the end. The flattened tips of my father's thumb and forefinger pinched each globe, then inched along to the next, the string of beads rotating in his grasp like stairs on an escalator. He did this while walking into the kitchen and over to the living room, with his fingers at my eye level, almost as if unaware of the movements they were making. "What is that, Abi?" I asked my father, still eyeing the beads instead of looking at him. The little circles were plain, but pretty, and seemed like the kind of thing a girl like me should have. Dainty due to my size and fragile because of my timidity and penchant for bursting into tears if even looked at unkindly, I was often treated like a girly girl. Never mind that I hated dresses, dolls, the color pink, and any doubt that I could keep up with a boy my age. I thought if I asked nicely enough, my father might give the beads to me. He sat down in a chair faced backward from the dining room table and gathered me onto his lap. His caramel-complected face stared into mine, except his was framed by a low, dark afro behind his receding hairline and a full black beard shading his jaw and chin. "These are zikr beads. They're for praying," he said, still not holding them out for me to touch. "But you're not praying," I said. "You're not even saying anything." "I'm praying in my head," he explained. "You don't always have to pray out loud, but Allah should always be on your mind and in your heart." My father used the hand not holding the zikr beads to point at my head and chest. I knew by then that Allah was God. My father most often referred to him as the Creator. He created the sun, the moon, the stars, the land, and all the people on it. And for that, we worshiped him. My father uncurled his fingers to show me the beads lay lightly across his palm. It was here, in his hands, that I'd get lost in the intrigue that was my father. I'd grasp his fingers and stare at the back of his hand. It bulged with pulsating veins I pressed down on and watched jump from side to side to avoid my index finger's pressure. I turn his hand over and study his palm, the intricate conglomeration of lines, fingerprints, and creases, so deep and dark they were like crevices, dangerous erosions formed over time through stress and to be avoided at all costs. unless I could learn to read them, figure out what they meant. And so I held his hand at different angles under varying lights, compared it to my grandfather's hand, and traced both of their creases with my tiny fingertips. Still, I couldn't decipher Abi, but I knew something was there. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was great. So to lead off, just sort of in your own words, who the heck are you?
I'm Sufia Abdurrahman. I am from Long Island, New York. I live in Annapolis, Maryland now. I teach journalism and creative writing at Washington College, which is on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. My education is primarily as a journalist, and I got a creative nonfiction degree from Goucher College. I'm also a wife and mother of two boys. One cute little face is right there on the camera. And yeah, I think that's me in a nutshell.
Great. Just real quick to the audience too, we really welcome audience questions. So if you have a question at any point along the way, put it in the chat window. I may not ask it right away, but I'm pretty good at keeping up with the questions that come in. So hopefully I will get to all of them, or as many of them as possible that come in. So please ask questions, and I'll remind you again about that later. So you mentioned, well, actually, first question is probably the hardest question. And it is, she's seen them in advance, she can agree. What's one thing you did in this book, or that you do as a writer in general, that nobody has really commented on or asked about? Sort of, in other words, is there a subject, small or large, that you'd maybe like to discuss but haven't had a chance yet?
Well, I'm still in the opening stages of talking about my book. So I would say so far, I haven't gotten that many questions yet. But
We'll
so
fix
far,
that.
no, that's fine. One thing that I haven't heard people comment on yet that I'm maybe wondering about is I use Arabic sometimes throughout the book talk about different phrases that people say. Prayers are in Arabic, and I haven't heard anyone comment about that yet. And I think that one thing that I noticed that I was, I guess, trying to do is that in English, particularly in American writing, we tend to shy away from foreign languages. I think that we're maybe a little bit scared of foreign languages, and the foreign part is what really, holds people back. And I feel like in Islam in particular, you kind of have to just get used to saying things in another language that you may not be that familiar with. So I was trying to normalize it a little bit in my book by just including the words in there. And so far I haven't had questions about it. So maybe that worked, I don't know. So yeah, that's something that I would want to hear from you, Zach. What did you think?
I mean, I rolled with it without flinching. I did occasionally pull up Google to make, when one was not, I mean, usually contextually everything was clear in the usage. There were only a couple times where, like, either I don't understand this word by itself, or I want the nuance of I want a little more nuance than the context is providing. So, I mean, that's me as a reader. I'm always excited I'm excited. I have the dictionary.com app on my phone. So even if it's an English word I don't know, I'm like, oh, exciting. So it makes me happy. So I was very pleased. The longer prayer sections, I didn't necessarily Google the whole prayer, but also, I mean, I'm not intimately familiar, but I'm not completely unfamiliar. So as a reader, I was in a good spot as a reader with all that. So for me, it worked very well. And I didn't think to ask about that, because it did not even register with me as like the normalization factor, I think, worked. So
thank you. Okay, good.
So you mentioned that you are married, and I didn't know who you were married to when we set this event up, but it's Rian Amilcar Scott, who was the very first guest of one of these chats.
Oh,
he kicked off this
really?
whole series. So, like, we're here today
Funny.
about 80 events later, because he was kind enough to join us that first time.
Oh,
But he posted something on Facebook that made me want to go down to lead with maybe some questions about your history as a writer, the history of this project, and maybe the publication process. He posted on Facebook, "It's been amazing to watch this book evolve over the last 10 years. Oh, it's a 10-year project. From idea to research to grad school thesis to draft after draft to contest winning final product." Sorry, something just tipped over in my house. I apologize. So can you share just the rundown of the life of this book, sort of from its infancy to today, maybe expand upon that little timeline that I just read?
Sure. So as I said, I was primarily a journalist. And so I wrote articles, and I had never written anything longer than a magazine article. But I had started writing essays, getting into more personal essays and writing from the first person, which was very foreign to me and a little bit uncomfortable. But I liked it. And as I started liking that more, I wanted to understand that type of creative writing more. So I took a class there at the Writing Center, at the Writer Center. And it was on personal essay and travel writing. And I really liked that. And I said, okay, now I have this idea for a book that I would like to create. And it was the story of second generation Black Muslims. I planned to interview a bunch of people from my generation, find out their experiences, and perhaps include a little bit of my own in it in book form, compile it all into a book. But I didn't know how to write a book. So I thought, class is not as bad as I thought it may be. So perhaps I can get an MFA program and do this and study it a little bit. So I did that. I went to an MFA program. I started working on that idea in that form. But the more that I wrote from different people's perspective and then also included my own, my classmates were like, this stuff is good, but we really want to see more about you and your family. And I was like, okay, if you ask me, sure, I'll give it a try. And I did, and they just enjoyed that part more. So I kept working on that, and it eventually just decided, okay, I'm gonna kind of incorporate what I've heard from other people into my story, making sure that I highlight some of the same issues or concerns that they had in writing this memoir that I ended up with. So after I graduated, I wrote this thesis as my graduation project from Goucher, but it was just that. It was a thesis. It was not a book. So it took some time for me to work on developing it, finishing it, finding a structure for it that worked before it became a book. And when it was like, okay, I said, all right, let me try sending it out to some people. Um, I think I went with agents first, trying to find an agent, and got some interest, but nothing that really stuck. And I did not have the patience to stick with that route for very long. So I said, that husband, he did get his first book published from a contest. So maybe I should try some contests out and see what happens with that. So I entered a couple of contests over one summer, and I was a finalist in one of them, and I was a runner-up in the other one. And I said, that's encouraging, but I didn't win, so I still have no book. So I kind of put it on the shelf for a while, and it was just like, I don't think I want to do this business side of writing anymore, and submitting and finding an agent. It's just too much. I just rather be writing. So I just left it alone for a little while. And in my scrolling through the internet one day, I saw the Iowa contest, and I saw who had won before me, an amazing essayist named Kendra Allen, whose book reminded me of my own writing. And I said, And previous judges had been Hanif Abdurraqib and Kiese Lehman, who I also identify with as a writer. So I said, maybe this is the right contest for me. And it turns out it was. So yeah, that was my process to getting to where I am today.
As first book contest winner as well, I'm well in the, yeah, I'm good with that route. I think it's also useful for writers to hear the story of the pre-publication process, that it's your story is definitely unique to you, but there are similar stories of people like figuring out you have the idea, you have the drive to work on this thing, but you actually takes a while to get it into the shape that becomes the thing that gets published.
Exactly.
And I think it's always important to the more times authors share that particular story, I think the better.
Yeah, it definitely took some work for me to figure out a structure that worked for the book, because that was the thing that really made it click. Obviously, like when I had different structures, it just wasn't coming together, and I was not very happy with it. But once I found the structure, I was like, okay, now I see how this works.
There was a two-part question that came into the chat. I'm going to jump to the second part, and I'll come back to the first part in a little bit. So what if you hadn't won the Iowa contest? What would you be doing with your book if you'd been a finalist again, for example?
Oh man, that's a good one. I don't even know. I'm not sure, because I may have just put it on the back burner and moved on with my second project, because I mean that's where I am right now in writing. mentally I'm just someplace else. So yeah, I may have hopefully found some kind of an agent who could do that part for me, and then I can focus on writing something different.
Nice. All right. I wanted to ask a little bit about the genre of the book, because as I read the book, I mean, I just loosely accepted it and thought of it as a memoir because it is a memoir. I don't think that's a bad, incorrect label, but I think it's a little more complicated than that when I was starting to think about it getting into it, because it is part memoir for sure, but it's also part family saga. And then it's also a little bit of splash of history, that not maybe more than a splash, but the history is not, there's not like giant historical sections, but there is a lot of revelation of history throughout the book. So what do you personally call this genre?
One thing that I've heard about it is reported memoir. I think that the way that I put the book together fits my my identity as a nonfiction writer. I am a nonfiction writer who started off as a journalist, who went into writing essays, who ended up with a memoir, who writes criticism and would like to get more into narrative journalism. And so I kind of put all of that into my memoir. It's definitely a mishmash of different things. But as a memoir, I felt like I can tell these other stories that are part of my story because they inform who I am. And it definitely answers the question that I set out to answer in writing this book in the first place, was to find out, okay, well, what is my identity as a second generation Black Muslim? I don't feel like I could have answered that question without the history and without the family saga, as you call it. But all of those different pieces to the puzzle, I feel like they all come together to inform me.
Were you even like, were you even thinking genre as you were working this project, or a genre thing that like you eventually have to label your book with a specific genre because you wrote the thing and have to sell it to a publisher? Were you thinking memoir as you wrote this, or is that a sort of an after the fact classification?
Well, because I was in an MFA program when I started it, that label got put on there, and so yeah, it was my faculty members who said, this is probably a reported memoir. And I was like, I like that term because it includes both. Yes, reporting and memoir. Right.
So sort of just thinking a little more broadly, what were your goals for this project as a writer and storyteller that led to the format? What were you maybe like, you hit on this a little bit, but like what led for you had suggestion of maybe the family and personal stories, but what led those to be brought together and sort of paired in a parallel structure going forward, and led to sort of your memoir, your reported memoir format, which I'm remembering for future reference?
Oh, no, that's fine. I think that a big part of it was me trying to investigate what the truth is. As a nonfiction writer, I feel like I'm always after finding some seedling of truth. And in me telling this story, I mean, I think as you read it, you will see that I'm narrating it from a particular point in time that was not now. It's either me when I'm like 6 years old, or me when I'm 16 years old, or my parents when they were 17 years old. And I don't try too much to interject my today voice in terms of, or knowledge, I should say, knowledge into that narrative. But that then makes the truth different, because what I knew when I was 16 is not what I know now. And what my parents knew when they were 18 is not what they know now. And so it does have this kind of back and forth about, and you'll see sometimes that I'll talk about the same events from different time periods, because I'm trying to investigate, well, what was true at that time and what is true now. And so I do go back and forth and interchange different points of view for that reason, because I feel like you're always going to get a different idea of truth depending on who's looking at the event and from what time period they're looking at it, or through what lens they're looking at it. So yeah, that's part of the story for me. Uh-oh, Zach, I
Oops,
think.
sorry. There we
Okay.
go. So the first part of the question I skipped over earlier was, when you write a memoir, is it harder to decide when it's finished versus, I guess, maybe reported work that you do?
Um, Probably not. It definitely takes longer, I'll say that. It took a lot longer writing this, but I don't think it was harder to decide what when it was finished because I felt like I knew what the end was early on, and I just had to figure out how to get from the beginning to the end. It was really that middle part, which is a lot of it, that was the struggle, but the beginning and the end weren't as hard. Sorry, I'm trying to turn this off. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So another question from the chat, and I think it's an important one, is how do you balance the work of raising kids, teaching, etc., with writing? What's your writing routine look like? And I might add, what did your writing routine look like pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and maybe what do you think it will look like once things hopefully get to a more normal? No. Okay, we're not going to look ahead.
I mean, the whole normal thing, I'm starting to lose a little. I shouldn't discourage anyone here. It just gets worse and worse all the time. But that's such a great question. I think that was that Maliha. I think
Yes.
that's a great question because it is a struggle, you know, all of the time when you are a full-time working mom and a creative writer. And particularly with another writer in the house and you both want your own writing space, that's a challenge. It's not one that I have an easy answer to. I would say that for me, and I'm definitely not the typical, I'm not your example that you want to follow. I'll just say that because I'm very dedicated to my students. So when I'm teaching, I'm really like into teaching, and I work on my lesson plans and grading and helping them out with, their personal problems and things like that. And I don't write as much when I'm teaching. However, during breaks in between semesters and over the summer, I'm very dedicated to my writing, and that's what I do. I'm more of a morning writer. I wake up very early and I will write, before, or try to write before anyone else in the house is up. Once the boys are up, it's more difficult, but I think that the little one has gotten used to just being next to me when I'm writing a little bit early in the morning and won't bother me quite as much. And so yeah, I'm also more of a writer who is moved by an idea rather than a schedule. If I have a good idea for something that I want to produce, I'm more motivated to just sit down and focus on that idea for however long it takes, rather than I must write at this time every day, or, the world is going to end. I'm not that kind of a writer. So I'll be okay if I'm not writing every day all of the time, as long as when I have that idea that I can sit down and devote my time to it. Does
Great.
that answer the question?
I think that was a good answer to the question. Yeah, I think that covered it. So getting back to the memoir itself, is I love a braided structure, and Heir to the Crescent Moon really has a great one. It weaves back and forth from the present of the narrator to the past of the narrator's parents. And I think you covered the origin of the structure, that you were originally doing something not quite in that genre, and people pushed you to dive into, I think, those elements. So obviously this seems to have evolved a lot from draft number 1 to the current draft. I think you made that pretty clear, or to the final draft, pardon me, current draft. We're well past drafting, to the finished book. There are no drafts anymore. So how do you consider the interrelationships between these chapters, though? Because it's almost, I think there's maybe a couple times where this breaks, but it's almost always narrator, parent, or some piece of history. So there's almost alternates back and forth in a braided structure. Do you intentionally try to carry themes over from adjacent chapters? How do you see them interconnecting and interrelating? And how do you maintain sort of the flow when you're bouncing back and forth between two different times?
Yeah, I think that while I was writing it, I should say while I was reporting it, I found certain echoes of themes, things that happened in my childhood experience that I was then hearing from my parents or someone else. And then realizing, oh, okay, like that's where that came from. Let me put these two pieces together and, see how it works. But of course, it didn't end up that way at first. It took a while before I figured out how to braid it together. But I definitely saw the echoes and knew that I wanted to tell this story that showed the inspiration for certain things that happened in my own childhood. And the braiding came about just kind of probably from reading other books and recognizing when other writers did that. And I said, oh, okay, so I do not have to stay here. I can move someplace else and come back later. And so then I was stuck with, okay, well, how do I move? Like, where do I make the changes between time periods? And I just ended up making it kind of intuitively, like, okay, this is a part where now I'm going to jump back in time, and it's not very uniform. It's not like one and then like present and then past, present and then past. There can be sections of like 3 chapters that are in the past, and then one that's in the present, and then no, 2 that are in the past, and then 2 that are in the present, and just kind of randomly goes that way, but it's thematic. That's how I made the decisions of when to go and what time period and with what theme is. Well, I mean, they both do progress chronologically, but
Mm.
it was more thematic as to when to do the breaks in the time period.
Is there anything else that either in your work or you've seen in other books that sort of use the same structure that uh, adds to the cohesiveness of the whole? Is there any other techniques or tricks that you? I mean, I'm just thinking. I'll give an example. And when I do weird little collage type pieces, not necessarily a fully braided work, but something with collage work. I mean, sometimes it's literally making sure words carry over from one part to the next. I mean, just little technical mechanical things, but is there anything else you think of in terms of that cohesiveness that even if a reader doesn't necessarily catch on to it, it'll maybe you hope they will internalize it and intuit it going through?
Yeah, I would say images for me is probably a thing. I mean, words and images probably go hand in hand. But I feel like I am kind of a visual writer. And so if there's something that the reader can see that's the same, then in their mind, they can make that connection and say, oh, I just saw that in that other chapter. Now I see it again. It's that echo. So I do think that that helps people to see the cohesion, hopefully, of this mishmash again, another mishmash of time periods that is happening here. Because yeah, I think even what you say there, and I was, been reading this to different people, and I was reading a chapter last night that I realized only when I was reading it, probably for like the second time, that not only does it go into the past, it goes like way into the past and then comes back up to the present. And it was just like, wow, there's like several generations of story within this one chapter. But I think it's instructive in terms of letting the reader know that to understand this identity, you have to understand all these other identities that came before it. And so I felt like going back in history was so important to telling the story.
Great. I think this is a good time to hop back over to the chat for a question, which was how much involvement did your father, and I would also add your mother and other family members, have in your process and maybe in reviewing as you went along, if any? And is it hard writing about your birth family?
Yeah, I interviewed them, my parents, especially my father, extensively in the reporting phase of this project. We sat down and asked him questions, and he'd answered questions, and I'd have follow-up questions and many, many more follow-up questions. And he was very cooperative. He was very helpful, and probably then forgot about everything that I asked him and what he said in response. And I wrote the book. And that in that interim period, we didn't really talk about the book. And then when I found out this book is probably going to be published, it was like, I should let him see what's actually in this book, and my mother as well. So I gave them each a copy of the book to read before it got to the point where I couldn't make any changes, in case there were any changes that they wanted made in the book. Um, And my mother read it diligently and made markings in there and was like, hey, Sophia, in this part you say lie and you really mean lay. And I was like, oh gosh, thanks, like that's just what I needed. And then my father, did not take it quite as well. I'll just say that. And it was very difficult because in certain parts of the book, Zach has read it, he does not have the best impression or does not leave the best impression on the reader. And he was not happy with that. And, it is what it is. It's a nonfiction story. So his problem was not that, I made things up or that I got things wrong. It's just that I was saying things that were not necessarily positive. And so that's difficult. It definitely, put a strain on our relationship for a time. And it has put a strain on other family relationships. But I felt like it was important to tell this story and, partly because of where I started with the book and speaking to other members of this second generation who in interviewing expressed a lot of pain for things that they had gone through, things that have been unaddressed, experiences that they haven't quite come to grips with. And so me writing this book was my way of coming to grips with certain things. And I felt like it was important to tell this story because there weren't a lot of other people telling it. And so it's a start, it's not everyone's story, obviously, but it is a start to telling a story that has not been out there very much in the public. So I'm hopeful that people will receive it well. My father did not, but he supports me in his own way. So.
Thank you. So this is, let's turn to politics because that's always good. But no, so a question in the chat was, given that the book took shape over a prolonged period of time, and I think this is a question I think I know a lot of writers are facing, is how did the changing political climate in the United States influence the writing and the project as a whole, if it did at all?
I don't think it did. I don't think it did because I didn't see the question in chat. I'm sorry. There are so many and I'm not really reading it, but I would just say that the changing political climate in this country is changing for some, and for some others, nothing is changing. It is what it has always been. And I don't think that for me, a lot has changed. And so for me writing this book, the climate hasn't had much of an effect. I do think it may have had an effect on how people receive it, perhaps even on me winning this award. But I was always hopeful that there would come a moment where people would want to hear this story. And that moment maybe took longer than I hoped it would, but now is that moment. So.
Great, thank you. So sort of an editing revision question from the chat. Did you write the memoir in a first draft and then edit the whole shebang, or did you write a few chapters and edit along the way?
Yeah, I'm an edit as I go kind of girl. And I'm not the typical writer. Everyone says, don't do this. This is not what you're supposed to do. Just do that vomit draft and then go back and edit. I do not like that. Vomiting is painful. It hurts so bad. I hate it, every minute of it. So I am very much a critical person. My critical eye and my critical brain, I feel like, are pretty sharp. So while I'm writing something, and if I can see that, oh, this does not work, I will change it immediately and I will try to get it right. I won't obsess over it, but try to get it right and then move forward from there. So yes, that makes me a slower writer. When I'm writing a piece like this, journalistically, I can still write fast, but it's just more enjoyable for me that way because it doesn't feel like vomiting. It feels like trying to write something that's satisfactory. So I do enjoy the writing and revision process while I go. It's kind of fun for me, actually.
Nice. So a question again about sort of the interview process and maybe an expansion on what we talked about earlier is, did you let your guest interviewees see the interviews and did you allow them to make any comment? No comments or changes from the interviewees?
No. Mm-mm.
That one's good. All right, so I'm going to go back to my questions for 1 second because I was very interested in the tone of the book, because one of the things that was really interesting to me is that you really successfully maintained a consistent tone from chapter to chapter, even though you're bouncing from personal experience to reported experience of the people you've interviewed and lived with, and then also even sometimes slight imaginings of what they might have done or might have been feeling. So you have to sometimes, I feel like, extrapolate that from the situations. But that's tone's, I think, pretty simple in a typical first person, this is my story from my perspective, constantly memoir. You end up writing in your own most natural voice, I think, usually when you come across those. But it's really interesting since we have several perspectives here. And how do you consider tone in general, especially coming from the journalistic background, which is I feel like tone in those conversations is slightly different than we maybe have tone conversations in creative writing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that one thing that helped me a lot is before I write, I always read something. It's whatever book I'm reading at the time, then followed by poetry, and then write. And so that always helps me get into the voice that I want to use in my writing. Hopefully it's good poetry, and I've maintained that habit. So it helped me maintain a consistent tone throughout the book, no matter if it's something that I wrote, years ago versus something I wrote months ago. And yeah, so whenever I found that I lost that tone, I was like, oh, okay, no, I need to go back and read something first, because this is feeling different. It's not quite right. And yeah, you're right. I could tell when I wrote something that didn't match. So I would go back and try to regain that tone that I had before. Because yeah, it takes you completely out of the story when it just is jarring, like that's different. What happened here? So yeah, I tried to work on that.
Was there anything, I mean, was that more difficult in the sections that were from parents and other perspectives to keep the tone consistent? Or where did you maybe find yourself drifting from the tone you were trying to maintain? Was it I suspect, I think if I were doing it, that's where I would feel myself getting away, because I'm suddenly not, I'm losing the I. And whenever I write with an I, it's always a much different process. So were there specific kinds of places where you were catching that issue?
Probably, and maybe in the historical sections, when I'm writing about things that I've researched. Now, I mean, I think it is okay to let it go a little bit in those parts, because you want to sound a little bit authoritative. So you may be able to let that go, but you also don't want it to be bland. So probably those historical parts for sure.
Yeah. And I did mean to say too, like, prose writers read poetry, prose writers read poetry, prose writers read poetry. It's the best thing you can possibly do as a prose writer. I have my little stack of poetry books right here, sitting next to my desk. So yeah, always have them ready. And I do the same thing, the same trick too, which is if I'm on a project, I usually have I decide beforehand 3 or 4 books that I sort of want to have beside me to read a chapter of or a few paragraphs of or whatever before I start writing. Sort of set my brain, not to copy that style, but there's something in that style that I'm looking for. And sometimes the books aren't even that similar to each other in that stack, but they just had something that I wanted to tap into when I was working on a project. So I think that's a great way to get the brain wired and going before sitting down to write.
Agreed.
A practical question for interviewers. What did you use to record and transcribe the interviews you did?
Just I guess you don't call it a tape recorder because there's no actual tape, digital recorder, sorry. And I just use Microsoft Word on my computer to write. I mean, I do both. I will record and type at the same time if it's over the phone or over a video chat so that I have a backup. If it's in person, I will write by hand and record so that I can transcribe and double check things later. Yeah, I'm pretty old fashioned, old school in that sense. I don't have a high tech system. I'm also looking at Holly's question in the chat. See, yeah, that one was short, so I can read it quickly. My go-to poets, because I'm a lover of poetry, I want to just give a shout out to Gwendolyn Brooks, who is my fave of all time. I also really like Yusef Komunyakaa. I have some newer poets that I like too. I like Tracy K. Smith, for sure, Jericho Brown. Oh, there's so many. There's so many great ones. But then also Sonia Sanchez, classic that I really enjoy. I'm getting into Ross Gay, and I'll leave it at that.
We could do this, could take up the rest of the chat time if we're
Yes,
just listing favorite
we
poets.
we
So,
could, probably could.
um, so you mentioned a class at the Writers Center. You mentioned MFA program. Have you had like a writing group or other writers read your work and give you input along the way? And what from that helped and what didn't help? I think that's actually a really great follow-up to that question.
No, that is good. So after I graduated from the MFA program, I did do a couple of writing workshops. One, well, they both were, and I might have done more than a couple, but the ones that I remember right now are Vona Voices writing workshop for writers of color. And the first time I went, it was out in California. I was part of a memoir group. There were about a dozen of us who were working with the memoirist Faith Adiele, who wrote a story about her experience. It's a religious book. And so she helped a lot in terms of how to write about faith in a way that people could grasp, even if they were not part of this faith. So I for sure found that very helpful. And even, perhaps the most helpful part of it was the group that I was with. We have kept in touch for years now. I guess that was 8 years ago, and we're still all in touch now. And so I did share my writing with some of the people from that group after we left, and get feedback from them. And I went back to Vona 3 years after that, different group of memoirists, but also working with another talented writer, Reina Grande. And yeah, it was just really helpful to bounce ideas off of other people, but at the same time to see what they were producing, because I feel like when you can review and edit other people's work, you learn a lot from just that process. Particularly because I think naturally kind of an educator kind of person. So, being in that kind of environment and being able to tell people this works, this doesn't work, perhaps you should try that, makes me then reflect on my own work and like, ooh, did I do that? Maybe I should try that too. And it just really helps out a lot. So yeah, what worked the best and what didn't work about it? What didn't work? I think trying to cover for any like mistakes or holes in your writing does not work because your colleagues or your peers in the group, they'll always be able to tell, like if you didn't do something that you were supposed to do, that does not work. So they'll be able to figure it out and tell you, no, you need to go back and actually do that. And I think that in memoir writing, the thing that happens most frequently is you as a writer will try to gloss over some experience that you really don't want to get into because it's painful, or because you'd rather not revisit it at this moment. Maybe you need some more time before you can sit down and write about that thing. And your peers will say, well, what happened right here is what I want to know. And then you're like, I have to focus on this thing that I was trying to avoid. And they'll say, yes. And I mean, so that helps because when you're writing by yourself, you're probably not going to tell yourself, ooh, you need to do this, but your peers will tell you, yes, you need to do this. So I think, yeah, it is really valuable to work with other writers as well.
I think too, you don't just learn how to like writing things when you're in a writer's group. You also learn how to ignore opinions that aren't relevant to you. And I
Yeah.
think that's the more of these you do, the more you'll be able to realize when someone says like, that just doesn't resonate with me and that's not a value I share. And that's okay. That's why all books aren't the same. So
That's a really great point, Zach. And that's something that I had to learn because after seeing some of the feedback, you said, I don't know if this one really resonates with me. I'm going to put this one aside. Yeah, for sure. You're right.
and everyone's eventually going to have a piece workshop that divides the workshop down the middle with half the people thinking one thing and half, or even an element of it, like just complete split, which just goes to show you that there isn't a right way, that you have the two camps that disagree completely on an element, so you're only writing for one of them. You can't write for both. Um, a process question in the chat. Did you outline the memoir, or was it a more fluid process?
I'm sure that I did outline at one point. I don't know if the book ended up being that outline. One tool that I remember from my Goucher days that was helpful was using the Post-it notes that you can put up somewhere. Like, here's this chapter, here's this chapter, and then how can we move them around and make the story work? I remember doing that at one point. Yeah, I tried a lot of different things to find what would actually ended up working.
Good. So another question from the chat: how did you narrow down which experiences you wanted to include? And I may follow up on that interesting point, like how much didn't make it into the book from what you gathered and thought about?
Yeah, that I think, again, in terms of the structure, that's the hardest part, because there are a lot of experiences that are relevant that you could include, but could throw off the book because it just doesn't fit in some other way, you know? So there were some things that I wrote that I thought were pretty good, but just didn't work with the structure that I came up with. And so I had to get rid of them. Perhaps it was, expanding the timeline too broadly, or I'm trying to think of other things that got cut out. Maybe introducing characters that ended up not being that relevant. So you cut those things out. And, perhaps at one point I may use those things at another time, but it was more important to me to keep it, it's not exactly compact, but to keep it tight in terms of focus. And it has this short timeline from my parents' experience. Well, it's not exactly short either, but at least when their time in the mosque, it's like this brief 4 years time period that I was trying to stay within. And then, and again, not introducing too many characters that could make the reader's mind go into different places that, was not relevant to the story that I was telling. So.
Great. I had a question about uh, just detail, because I think I love the texture of the book. It's a very light texture, and I can't discuss. I don't want to say anything because I don't know what any of these words really mean when you're talking about texture. But it's not an incredibly dense book. There's lightness to it. And I think one of the things is that you are really cunning with your detail selection. It's not like there aren't these giant lush passages of detail flowing down the page, but when a detail comes, it is a very key and poignant detail. And so I thought that was a very strong element of the book, and one of the things that kept me I kept like reading really fast and then slowing down. It was like I wanted. Anyway, it was great. I'm rambling now. It was great, great details. So, how did you select details of characters and settings and objects that you included? What stood out to you as a detail worth including?
Ooh, well, first I'll just say to you, Zach, that's the thing that I'm hearing the most, I think, from people who've read it so far, is how quickly it reads. And I'm like, oh man, is that a bad thing? I don't know. So like, I read it so fast. It was like a real page turn. I was like, okay, it's good, I think. Details, how did I choose? I think for me, because my characters primarily are family members, there are certain things that stand out in my mind about them, that are easily identifiable with that person. With my siblings, I'm one of four who grew up in my house, and one of six in total. We'll have certain jokes about people, and we could just say like one word or one gesture, and then we'll know exactly what we're talking about. And so it's those kinds of details that to me identify who that person is. So that may be the thing that I focus on. And in trying to study my own memory, the things that I remember doing, like in that opening passage that I read, that part about, looking at the hands is just something that I really remember doing when I was a kid. I would just go up to people and grab their hand and take a look at it. And I remembered it was definitely my father and my grandfathers that I would study the most. And so that was really important for me to identify how I related to him as a child. Like he had these hands that were just fascinating and big and, you know, rough and had been through so much. And so I wanted to express that.
Yeah, great. I'm also recalling now the table and the replacement table is maybe my favorite. My favorite use. I'm not gonna say more because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. I feel like I can tease that without spoiling the exact scenario there.
That's funny that you remember that, because it's kind of like one of those throwaway details, but it was important to me. Like, what kind of person would get this thing?
It's a great characterization of your father.
Right.
I mean, that's a really, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I want to go to, I think we have time for maybe one more question from the chat. And I think there's a good process question that people are really interested in pretty often. So I'd like to do that, which is, can you describe the revision process with the editor? We've talked sort of about revision in general, but what was this book when it got accepted for the prize versus what was it that we were holding in our hands now?
I was actually hoping you would not answer that question.
Oh no, I didn't ask it. You have to blame the chat.
I don't know if I have a diplomatic answer to that question, except to say that I worked with the copy editor pretty extensively, because again, my lion lay is not great. and I also use like instead of as, and there's just certain grammatical things that in my vernacular, some people were not as comfortable with. And I had to work on, what I was willing to change and what I was like, no, this does not reflect my style. And I'm trying to remember some other things that came up in terms of the Arabic, for example. There were questions about how it should look in print, whether it should be italicized or not italicized, whether we needed a glossary, things like that I remember. But yeah,
that seems like there's a few real difficulties and like biased expectations, it seems like, coming in there a little bit. So I understand where you're coming from, and I'm sorry that you had to deal with it. And
it was not bad. I shouldn't give the impression that it was a bad thing. No, it was more of the sense that when you are a creative writer, and this is for all of you guys, because I'm sure everyone has their own style. When you are a creative writer and you are meticulous about your word choice and your syntax and all of that sort of thing, when you have to work with an editor who have their own ideas about, the Chicago Manual of Style and Merriam-Webster and what things mean, and their training is good. They're good at what they do. It's just different from what you do. So marrying those two together is a process, because yes, you want to be grammatically correct, but yes, you also want to be able to use words creatively. So how do you find that happy medium is what, what's something that I had to work on.
Yeah. Well, I think I hope you're happy with the medium that you found, because it's certainly. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. You're right.
We're almost out of time here, so I did want to jump to our usual last question. And this is a question especially for the aspiring writers who maybe joined us today in the audience. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out, either on a book project or just starting out writing in general?
I have to say, read, and read, and then take a class, and then read some more. Reading is so important for everyone to do, especially writers. You can find voices that you haven't heard before. You can find styles that you may want to emulate. You can find writing that you think is horrendous and you never want to see again, but it's all going to be instructive. And the more you read, the more you know, the more you can use in putting it in your toolbox or your backpack, and figuring out, where does your voice come in? I found reading just to be so important. And I tell my students this all the time, as they don't do my assigned readings, that you have to read. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good time to mention too, that we have a great option of the next thing you could read. Heir to the Crescent Moon by our guest, Sufia Abdurrahman. Sufia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a joy and a pleasure, and I've learned things, and I hope everyone else here who joined us tonight learned something as well.
Thank you so much, Zach. I had a lot of fun talking to you. We should talk more some other time.
Yeah, we'll have to get together. We can hang out sometime. We can invite Rian too.
Yeah, you can come too. All right. Thanks all for coming. I appreciate it.